What's going on, guys? You voted for it, so I'll talk about it. Primitive Christianity and the decline of the West. Earlier, I asked, what is the primary force behind the West's decline? It was a deliberately open-ended question, and I believe the wide variety of responses I got were each all correct in a sense. There are so many different ways to slice this pie. It's such a big topic, but it's also a very important one as we are regularly confronted with new moral crises and geopolitical situations every day. An answer to the question of the West's decline implies the West had a peak, which raises the question of what this peak was and why. Is it material, moral, intellectual, spiritual? The answer to the question on your part seems to be political polarization as a result of underlying moral decline. That seemed to be the general tenor of responses to the poll. I think as a rule, we can all agree on that as a first step. But then there's more to the story. What is this moral decline? How do we determine what human standards of behavior should be? The answer, generally, again, seems to be traditional religion. Fair. This is a right leaning audience. In the West, that religion is Christianity. Now we're invited to make sense of the current declining state of the Christian religion in the West today, as well as the history of the religion in this area of the world generally. In my opinion, Western decline stems in part from intellectual and cultural fragmentation exacerbated by Christianity's deviation from its primitive roots. Before we jump in, I'd like to remind you, please give this video a like, share, subscribe if you haven't already. Hit that bell button to get notified when new videos come out. Consider donating to me on Patreon. Also, this is going to be a little bit of a controversial video. Lots of opinions, so don't get all butthurt about it if I say something that offends you. I'm just some guy online, yada, yada, yada. Nothing to get angry over. I'm just talking, just sharing some things that have been on my mind. But anyways, let's dive into it. So capital P ideological Protestantism is basically the belief that the Protestant Reformation is an ongoing process toward the attainment of primitive Christianity. The early reformers knew their work was by no means complete and expected theologians after them to continue their work. Ideological Protestantism holds that the pursuit of primitive Christianity is a perpetual process. It's not about preserving a fixed tradition, but about renewal, questioning institutional practices, and aligning with the simplicity and authenticity of early Christian teachings. The concept of ecclesia semper reformanda, the church is always reforming, or as I always thought it was, always reforming, never reformed, heavily informed the ethos of many of the Protestant reformers and their successors. The idea was the church submits itself again and again to the judgment of God's word, asking itself if its practices and beliefs are in line with Scripture. Early reformers like Luther and Calvin indeed saw their work as incomplete and assumed future generations would continue refining doctrine and practice. But if you look carefully and notice, there are still some notable distinctions and nuances between what's actually written in the Bible and what became Western Christian tradition, Protestant or Catholic. By the Middle Ages, the Western Church had developed a complex hierarchy and authority style, combining elements of both traditional authority and rational legal or bureaucratic authority. And over time, just looking at the complexity of the institution, it becomes undeniable that many aspects of this were just nowhere present in early Christianity. Things like papal primacy, rooted in apostolic succession, and papal indulgences would be traditional authority, whereas bureaucratic systems like canon law, ecclesiastical courts, and diocesan administration would be rational legal. And these are all clear innovations. Cue the moment when the one Catholic apologist that watches this channel begins violently typing out a hate comment. The advent of the Reformation created a theological cleavage which justifies two essentially different modes of government. And there was, of course, a spectrum of belief within Catholicism itself as well. And people got caught up on the details of these narratives rather than focusing on working cooperatively as a community of believers. There were now just a ton of competing meta narratives that further fueled conflict and confused things. By contrast, for instance, Chinese civilization has consistently reformed itself into a unified state. The distinctiveness of the Chinese mindset is evidenced in their dynastic cycles, because regardless of the context, contingent meta narrative of the particular state that's ruling over that people at a particular time, like Song Dynasty, Tang Dynasty, like that, the people of China as a whole retain a deeper commitment to the project that is their civilization. So the Chinese always, whatever government they're living under, they see this as just one phase of the broader organism that is China throughout time. Right. I think this is in part due to the fact that Chinese people generally are less idealist than Western people. They don't have theology or institutional religion in the way that the West does. Because, for instance, a pure Catholicism would be a country governed by these ecclesiastical courts or synods, which legislate canon law based on their interpretations of the teachings of Jesus and Paul in the New Testament, according to Catholic theology. So, like, if you look, if so, in a Catholic dominated society, the church would be the ultimate governing authority. It would be completely theocratic, and then you'd basically have a priesthood that sort of decides and governs how we live our daily lives, which is based on their interpretations of Jesus and Paul's teaching in the New Testament. Some Catholics will deny this, but really, you want to talk to like an actual old school consistent Catholic, like this would be a global system. The Catholic Church is the one universal church. All the apostolic churches are like this. The Eastern Orthodox, Oriental Orthodox, they all are sort of claiming to be this one universal organization, the one true church. Um, by contrast, a pure historical Protestantism, as the Reformers conceived it, is living under a secular monarchy which enforces the moral law of the Old Testament. So, in the historical Protestant view, you are justified, that is, saved by faith, but sanctified by works. So your behavior is still governed by the Old Testament civil law, while also being informed by Jesus and Paul's teachings in the New Testament. So rather than your daily life being governed by this priesthood's interpretation of the teachings of Jesus and Paul in the New Testament, civil law would be based on the moral law in Leviticus as well as the teachings of Jesus and Paul, which is, some people would say, you're circumcising a mosquito, but then when if you were to fly back into like 1500s Europe, these would be very significant distinctions, and their theological implications are still relevant today. Modern evangelical political science obviously deviates significantly from this, because you talk to your average boomer Christian, say, and their understanding of Christianity is compatible with contemporary liberal democratic secular humanist governments. Like, if you were to go back in time, take a time machine back to 1500 and talk to like John Calvin or something, he'd be like, what are you talking about democracy? What are you talking about voting? Like it was a complete, there was a real shift in the understanding of legitimate authority that occurred over the past 1,000 years in Christian thought. And contemporary evangelical political science is more like historical Anabaptism, as typically, even in conservative circles, Old Testament moral law is viewed as non-binding and rationalized away as less relevant. Evangelicalism has a sort of static nature, and it's kind of retreated from national politics. You see all these woke people appearing, like the Christian right, the evangelical right that was so powerful with Reagan in the 80s has kind of, and with Bush to a lesser extent, has really kind of taken a back seat in culture. You know, you have freaking Lizzo or someone twerking at the Super Bowl. Unthinkable 60 years ago, unthinkable 40 years ago. And evangelicalism has a sort of intellectual narrowness. And I think this reflects the general exhaustion of Western civilization. As a religious movement, it's proving itself basically unable to deal with Western moral decline. In that light, we can say the Reformation as a project has obviously failed, or at the very least remains incomplete, at least from the framework of ideological capital P Protestantism, because it begins as this sort of Protestantism begins as this sort of deconstruction of what was then traditional Christianity, the medieval Catholic Church, and now it ends in people arguing over like people going to mega churches and arguing over like worship music. Like it's totally, you know, and while there's drag queen story hour somewhere else in the US, it's completely ineffective as a religion. It's not getting anything done. This country's still declining. um Whether you view it personally as failed or not is up to you, I suppose. I'm just saying the initial reformers viewed their project as incomplete, and there was never an official consensus on when it ended. In a sense, the Reformation is a deconstruction of what was then traditional Christianity or medieval Catholicism. Leftism is not synonymous with deconstruction generally, however, as the Renaissance, which was caused in part by the natural decaying of the power of the Roman Catholic Church over the civil governments of Europe, as well as the general improvement in material conditions of Europeans, largely through trade in the Mediterranean, caused the scientific revolution, which led to secularization, not Protestant criticism of traditional medieval Catholicism itself. I just want to make that clear. But to circle back, if you look carefully, you'll see Levitical law is even more patriarchal in some ways than traditional Christianity. Current Christian apologetics attempts to account for this, but that's only because current Christian apologists more or less are just defending Christian tradition. That is the normative and ethical standards of the reformers and what they understood traditional Christianity to be. Modern Christian leaders defending traditional Christianity are just little p Protestants in the sense that they inherited much of their theology from the original reformers. But as a movement, institutionally speaking, these two religious movements have basically nothing in common. Modern evangelical Christianity is in no way a deconstruction of anything. It more or less sees itself as complete, and its mission is really just to spread globally. So that was all a very long and dense way of me saying that simply a return to traditional Christianity won't solve these problems. And evangelical Christianity and the apostolic churches as movements aren't equipped to even try to pull something like that off. One of the key issues of modernity is the lack of social cohesion and breakdown in meta narrative, which you guys noted in the poll as political polarization. But the deeper issue is even on the right, there isn't a clear vision of what the West generally is supposed to be. There's a million answers to this question, and especially theologically, they either don't properly acknowledge these underlying tensions and problems, or the ideal government and culture they describe is totally fringe and alien. Like, you know, as I was describing earlier with radical Catholicism or radical historical Protestantism. Another important thing, too, and this reminds me of a comment that someone left, is that a lot of commonly held assumptions about God are just not true in ways that can have serious implications for a person's moral outlook. Here's another very controversial deconstruction. Notions of objective good and evil are actually social constructs based on a Greco Roman conception of natural law rather than biblical ethics. And biblical ethics are concerned with loyalty and disloyalty to the Most High God across various contexts and circumstances. God is conceived of as in no way all loving, and acts like what the Israelites did to the Canaanites are only situationally immoral. An unconditional, all-loving God is very much a modern idea without a real basis in Scripture. I really do think there's fewer issues and no tension when you look at the Christian religion this way. You're not going, God is absolutely XYZ, so therefore this must be true. You're looking more directly at how he has revealed himself through history to us. We have this moral squeamishness now because we are raised in a historically speaking very safe, predictable, and orderly environment here in the West. And I really wonder how you can effectively spread the Christian religion, the truth of the Christian religion, while not confronting people with the raw reality of the human experience.
God not being all loving is just not something I've heard.
Oh, yeah.
Like growing up.
So God so loved the world that he gave his only son. World is assumed to mean every single individual human being, when in well, I mean, it's been sort of watered down because you go into like it can be a quote unquote Calvinistic Baptist church, but then they're like 4-point Calvinists, so they still say that that Christ died for everyone, when really in traditional Calvinism, God sent Christ to die for the elect specifically. So God is not all loving in Calvinist thought. Basically every other school of Christianity does sort of affirm that God is all loving. But then there are passages like where God is, there are passages in the Old Testament where God is described as hating groups of people or parts of humanity or specific individuals, and they sort of these other schools of Christianity sort of have to reconcile the idea that God can be all loving while also hate certain things. Traditional Calvinism, so far as I know, is the only system within Christianity that it doesn't have to deal with that problem in like a coherent way. But no, the world is reinterpreted as like the project of creation more generally speaking. I think like the world as in, when someone talks about the world, the world generally, not every individual in the world, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that would be a quick way of explaining what's meant, although like I'm not a theologian, so I'm sure there are other explanations.
That makes sense.
So I think this dovetails well with, because the sort of one issue with reconstructing historical Christianity is that there isn't a clear basis for this concept, which is called limited atonement. So in mainstream Christianity, Christ is understood as dying for all people and in the place of all people. And an individual, through an act of their own free will, accepts the gift of his sacrifice and then becomes saved. I think in traditional Calvinism, this isn't the case, and Christ dies specifically for the elect. That's why it's called limited atonement. And personally, with these sort of crises around identity in the modern world and not being able to distinguish between friend and foe, like I think it's important to understand that God's love and respect very much is covenantal. You won't necessarily know who is in the new covenant, who is a true believer and who isn't. You can't know that with like a scientific certainty, but you still have to operate in that sense. Like there isn't a call to just fling wide your borders at the expense of your own personal health, or just let other people in because of the supposed brotherhood of all humanity. Jesus said to cast out people who don't mend their ways as though they're heathens and publicans. The New Testament is very tribal in that sense. It does not it does not it's not universalist. It's not indiscriminate in that way. It's comparatively indiscriminate in the sense that it's acknowledging that the Hebrews have lost their specific place as God's chosen people. The Mosaic covenant certainly is over. They've failed for the last time. But now any group of people is free to go and follow God on their own terms and form their own uh, uh, communities. And I'm just a guy with opinions, and I love to hear your opinions. I hope you really, I hope if you got anything out of this video, I hope you found it engaging, entertaining, enjoyable, thought provoking, got your noggin jogging, so to speak. That's really the goal of this video. You know, I'm not demanding that everyone agree with me. If you have some objections, post them in the comments. Why not? Um, I'm just here to like discuss ideas, if you know what I mean. So I hope you liked it, and Red Channels will catch you in the next one.